Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Manisha Thomas. I'm with PHAP, and it is my pleasure today to welcome you to this webinar, The Road to COP27, Strengthening Humanitarian Perspectives. This is the sixth session of the learning stream on climate change and humanitarian action that's been organized by ICFA and PHAP. And it's my pleasure to introduce my co-facilitator, Nishani. Nishani, you want to say hi?
Hi, Manisha. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, perhaps to some. So thanks for joining this webinar. It's going to be an interesting topic for discussion. Before we start, over to Manisha to continue on some of the sound checks. Over. Thank you so much, Manisha, and welcome to our sixth session of the webinar series on climate and humanitarian action under our learning stream. And today we are going to talk about the road to COP27. Why should humanitarian NGOs engage? And we will be taking a closer look at commitment number 6 of the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organization that calls on us to use our influence and to mobilize urgent and more ambitious climate action and environment protection. The Charter commits us to work together to foster ambitious action on climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, and to ensure protection of those who are the most vulnerable so that they're not left behind. The humanitarian sector is uniquely placed to influence legal and policy frameworks and to better channel attention and resources towards most vulnerable and at-risk people. So over the last few years, we've seen a significant increase in awareness by the humanitarian community of the impacts of the climate crisis. Of course, because we're also faced with this in our work, in our day-to-day work, and where we are placed in crisis context. And in turn, we have seen a greater presence and engagement of humanitarian actors in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC process. You will hear this acronym today a lot. Almost every year since 1995, world leaders have gathered to discuss climate change at the Conference of Parties, also known as COP, another acronym you will hear more today. All states that are parties to the Convention on Climate Change are represented at the COP, at which they review the implementation of the Convention and any other legal instruments that COP adopts and takes decisions necessary to promote the effective implementation of the Convention, including institutional and administrative arrangements. More of this from our speakers. Following COP26 last year, we saw more humanitarian actors engaging and raising awareness of impacts of climate change on the most vulnerable communities. However, we as a humanitarian community need to further articulate what we see is our collective role. We need to better understand how we can galvanize the humanitarian community to deliver when it comes to climate action and advocacy, and in particular in conflict, fragile, complex emergency and humanitarian contexts in order to meet humanitarian needs. We need to understand better how can we leverage our presence, our expertise and insights to work with multilateral institutions, governments, and other organizations to ensure that greater focus on the impacts of climate crisis on communities and people most vulnerable are taken into consideration at decision-making level. So the next Conference of Parties, COP27, will take place in Sharm El-Sheikh in Egypt in November this year, with the Arab Republic of Egypt taking over the presidency. And one of the key focuses of this COP is on loss and damage, another term you're going to hear often on our webinar. Extreme weather events like cyclones and slow onset processes such as drought and sea level rise can cause loss and damage to human societies, infrastructure, and to the natural environment. But the question is, how does COP27 and loss and damage relate to our work and the work of humanitarian actors? How do we need to engage in these discussions and processes? And how can we engage to ensure that decision makers take into account humanitarian needs and the needs of communities most vulnerable to climate change impacts? To unpack these questions today, we have a great lineup of speakers, and I'm going to hand over the floor back to Manisha so that she can introduce our speakers. Over to you, Manisha.
Thanks very much, Nishani, for all those acronyms that you've explained, but also sort of setting the scene for what we're doing today. And to introduce us to the different initiatives that they've been implementing, we're joined by 5 speakers today. We first have Jasmine Moussa, who is Counselor, Legal and Humanitarian Affairs at the Permanent Mission of Egypt in Geneva. Welcome, Jasmine. We've got Nina Brooklyn, who is the Senior Advisor on Disaster Displacement and Climate Change at the Norwegian Refugee Council. Welcome, Nina. We've got Kirsten Hagen, who is Senior Analyst, Humanitarian Policy at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, or IFRC. Welcome, Kirsten. We've got Colin McQuiston, who is Head of Climate and Resilience at Practical Action. Welcome, Colin. And then last but not least, we have Lindsay Walsh, who is Climate Policy Advisor at Oxfam GB. Welcome, Lindsay. So with that, as we've already mentioned, we do hope that you will share your questions, your comments, but also some of your own examples of your work in the chat as well as the Q&A. So please do feel free to use both of those options throughout the session. Sorry, we won't keep you all day, I promise. So I've got a couple of questions for you, Jasmine, to start off. The COP27 presidency, for you, why is the COP27 presidency let me start again. I haven't had enough coffee this morning. I'm sorry. As the COP27 presidency, why do you think this COP is important for countries that are developing in conflict or are already heavily impacted by climate change?
First, good morning to everyone, and thank you so much to PHAP and to ICFA for organizing this webinar and for inviting us to give a few remarks. And we really value this opportunity, and thank you, Nishani, for setting the scene. So just to emphasize what Egypt's priorities will be for COP27, and to really underline that we are very keen to make sure that our priorities are grounded in the science and the evidence. We had recently the IPCC Working Group 2 report, which came out, which painted a really grim picture in terms of the humanitarian impacts of climate change, particularly for persons already in vulnerable situations, such as those in developing countries, climate vulnerable countries, and conflict-affected countries. In addition to protracted displacement, the rapid and slow onsets of climate change threaten food security, water security, livelihood security, and socioeconomic development, and they continue to cause loss and damage worldwide. And the related risks and societal damages are projected to increase with every degree of global warming. And I believe other speakers will maybe elaborate a bit more on that. But at the same time, the Working Group 2 report proposes a number of solutions and key transitions that require immediate action. And in order to avoid further loss and damage, we really must act now to step up climate adaptation and mitigation measures, coupled with the necessary means of implementation. So having said that, it is quite clear that adaptation gaps and needs are rising, while there are also financial constraints to adaptation, particularly for developing countries. And this is particularly true for Africa, which is indeed a paradox since Africa contributed least to the climate crisis. However, it's the most vulnerable to its devastating consequences. And since Egypt is hosting the COP on behalf of Africa, we're keen to address Africa's priorities in Sharm El-Sheikh and make this also the COP in which we shift from pledges to delivery and implementation. So our priorities include delivering on the outcomes of the Glasgow Climate Pact to keep 1.5 degrees within reach, to ensure accelerated delivery of the $100 billion, make progress towards doubling adaptation finance, and the new collective goal for climate finance, as well as providing means of implementation, access to technology, and capacity building. And in addition, loss and damage will be addressed, and we hope this will be addressed in a practical, effective, and impactful manner, which balances the views of various parties. And we saw recently in the SB's meeting in Bonn that the issue of loss and damage came up in terms of how we should address it in the negotiation track, but also the operationalization of the Santiago network. And we're very keen to remain engaged in the discussions on these issues. Just to emphasize that we really believe it's high time to focus our attention on the full and active implementation of the Paris Agreement and all its aspects. And this doesn't mean that there aren't crucial issues remaining on the multilateral negotiations agenda, but work on these issues must proceed in parallel with actual implementation action on the ground. And just to remind, and again, other speakers will maybe elaborate on this a bit more, but when we talk about loss and damage, we're talking about averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. So we hope to be able to make progress on all these issues in parallel. And in the informal track of COP27, we're developing a number of initiatives and a number of thematic days in which these issues will be addressed. And some of the specific issues are agriculture, food security, adaptation, finance, and others. With respect to the issue of averting loss and damage, the WMO Secretary General recently completed a visit to Cairo, in which he discussed, among other things, how to support WMO's efforts to launch an action plan at COP27 to implement the UN Secretary General's initiative on covering everyone on the planet with early warning systems within 5 years. Early warning and early action saves lives and averts and minimizes loss and damage, and represents an important contribution to adaptation and resilience, particularly in Africa, where only 60% of people are covered by early warning systems. So we're very keen to promote this agenda, promote preventive action and anticipatory action, and also very keen to hear from others on their priorities and views of how we can address these issues.
Thanks very much, Jasmine. And can I ask you also, with the COP presidency, how do you see the importance of engaging civil society and NGOs, and particularly humanitarian NGOs, in the discussions?
Thank you again, Manisha, for that question. It's a very important one because obviously the intergovernmental process is the core of the COP process. But the reality of the matter is that all stakeholders have to contribute if we're to succeed in addressing this global challenge, particularly those that are on the ground and that feel the impacts of climate change every day and see its impact on our societies. So Egypt is very committed to an inclusive process that brings together all stakeholders. And I just mentioned the SB's meeting in Bonn, and our COP president was keen to meet with civil society representatives there, particularly on the issue of loss and damage, and to hear what they have to say and how they feel this agenda should be brought forward. We have appointed a climate champion to link the multilateral process with the stakeholders, whether in civil society, the business community, academia, the scientific community, grassroots organizations, indigenous groups, cities and municipalities, and obviously the humanitarian community. Our permanent mission here has convened several consultations. One of them was the Climate Science Humanitarian Dialogue that we co-organized with IFRC in the UK, in which we had a very rich conversation with the humanitarian community. We've also been organizing consultations on, for instance, women's inclusion at the COP, how to ensure a gender-sensitive process, and with other stakeholders. We particularly welcome our ongoing dialogue with the full range of actors that constitute the humanitarian community, including local actors and affected communities whose perspectives are indispensable to addressing climate change and reaching those that are most vulnerable. And we really hope that this engagement will go beyond just events and consultations to the next level of actual implementation. So the participation and contribution of the humanitarian community in the various initiatives and in the implementation aspects of the global agenda. And we feel that the Climate and Environment Charter is a very positive step, and Nishani already talked about Commitment 6. But we also want to emphasize the commitment to focus on climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and anticipatory action, while simultaneously requiring the humanitarian community to reduce its own carbon footprint. We think the humanitarian community can play an indispensable role in overcoming the siloed approach and to help bridge the climate and DRR agendas, as well as the other global processes that are taking place that are related to mobility, such as the recently held International Migration Review Forum and the Global Refugee Forum. And upcoming in 2023, we're going to have the midterm review conference on water. And as we know, water and climate change are inextricably linked. So we would really like to see the humanitarian community strongly represented there. So, as we can see from this event and others, humanitarian actors really have the power to mobilize and convene. And now more than ever, we need to join our forces and inspire each other to drive commitments and implementation at scale. And we really look forward to receiving any proposals on how to address the humanitarian impacts of climate change during COP27. And I should add that from the various consultations that we've organized, we see that a lot of stakeholders have very specific asks and very very specific agendas and very specific plans, for example, to convene particular summit meetings, dialogues, to have specific targets. So, for instance, on the issue of women's empowerment, there are specific targets about including women in negotiations. And I think we would very much welcome seeing some specific asks from the humanitarian community. Thank you so much, Manisha.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. And maybe just a question of clarification. You said there's the midterm review conference on water next year. What is that? I'm sorry, just because I don't know. I'm imagining others may not know either.
Thank you. Thank you for asking that question. So in March 2023, there's going to be the midterm review of SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation. And we have been very keen to talk about how we need to overcome fragmentation between these various agendas. So we're very keen to link the water and climate agendas, and we have a specific initiative on water at the COP, but also this includes early warning and early action. And we believe these agendas are very tightly linked. So the DRR agenda, the water agenda, and the COP agenda, and the climate change agenda. So we would really like to see the humanitarian community galvanizing and participating strongly. And if I may add that we're having a Geneva-based consultation tomorrow, which we're calling the Geneva Water Dialogue, as an input to the 2023 conference. And we have a specific panel on water and DRR, and another specific panel which will address water in humanitarian settings. And given how much attention the IPCC Working Group 2 report paid to water, and the impacts of floods and droughts on loss and damage, we would very much like to see the humanitarian community contribute to these discussions.
Super. Thank you very much for that, Jasmine. I'm going to hand over to Nishani because I think she's also got a question for you. But thank you so much, Jasmine.
Thanks, Jasmine. There's a lot happening, and it's great to see that Egypt is really engaging civil society and other organizations, especially the humanitarian sector. And I think some of the questions that we're getting from some of the participants is, how can NGOs be part of the focus group discussions because of the COP27 coming up, and how can they take part and make more commitments or contribute to commitments? So that will be good to hear. And how can we engage even at the COP27? Where would that be the space be for humanitarian actors and NGOs alike? First, maybe you from that, and then I can get on to something else, maybe if there is some.
Thank you so much, Nishani. So just as a general comment, so to actually participate in the COP, is the civil society organizations need to already have observer status, and that takes about 2 years. So we've faced this challenge because Egyptian civil society, African civil society from the region thought, the COP is coming to Africa, we need to be there. And we were surprised that we, weren't able to formally integrate them in the process. But having said that, what we are trying to do as much as possible is organize these other consultations on the road to COP27. And we have several organizations that have contacted us and that have told us that, for example, they are forming networks, and that through those networks, they will be providing us with inputs, with suggestions, with policy papers, with recommendations. So we welcome that very much. And as I said previously, we have a climate champion whose role is specifically this, to engage with all non-state actors, basically all stakeholders other than states. And we would be very keen to make those connections, to make sure the voices of everyone is heard. And Nishani, if you would like to pass on my contacts, and I would be happy to make those connections, and also to receive any recommendations, inputs, policy papers that civil society would like to pass on to the presidency.
Great. And actually, we will definitely reach out, and we will reach out maybe for a consultation with the humanitarian organizations, NGOs specifically. We have, as ICFA, we have over 140 members in 160 countries. So there's a lot to contribute. And as we can hear already in today's webinar with our speakers who are NGOs and members and partners, there's a lot already happening, and they're wanting to engage. And I think this will be a definitely useful process that we can contribute, and happy that Egypt is also welcoming this sort of consultations with the champion, etc. I think there's also one more question that I might like to put out to you. It's a little bit more broader than NGOs, but one of the questions is with the economic crisis increasing globally with COVID-19, what would COP prioritize and agree on how global partnerships could support countries going through crisis and not being able to provide as much, invest on climate change and mitigation and adaptation? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nishani. Obviously, that's a priority for us. So we all know how adaptation financing is really a fraction of what it should be, and we have repeatedly stated that number one, we are very keen to work on reaching the goal of $100 billion, but also to at least double adaptation financing, or at least reach a 50-50 between adaptation and mitigation. That is definitely a priority for Egypt. And obviously, there are difficulties. There are global economic challenges that we are all facing. But this challenge, the climate crisis, is really the most pressing and the most important, and one that we must all address. And so we are definitely placing as a high priority the issue of climate finance, the issue of means of implementation, the issue of increasing financing for adaptation in particular, and reaching a new collective goal for finance. I could provide more details through my colleagues in Cairo, because obviously we don't have the full picture of what has been done on that end. And if you would like, I would be happy to provide more details on that.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And indeed, it's a trying times for everyone. But over to you, Manisha, to introduce the next speakers. Thanks, Jasmine. And I know you need to leave in a while. Thank you so much for being on our webinar. And we'll definitely have more options and opportunities to engage with you and Egypt and the champion in future discussions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Nishani, and thanks again to the organizers and to everyone. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jasmine. Before I turn to our next speaker, I'm just going to quickly walk us through the results from that first Menti poll that we have. And as we can see here, that first question, how familiar are you with the priorities of humanitarian organizations and climate negotiations? It's coming, all of the answers are towards the not so familiar end. Some were kind of not really that familiar. So I think this webinar is very well placed right now to really help us understand a little bit more the efforts around how we can coordinate input to the climate negotiations, and we'll understand a bit more how the negotiations have been structured or will be structured. So Jasmine, thank you so much for the introduction. And I think that poll tells us that this is a very timely event to have today. I would like to then move on to our next speaker, Colin, who is going to talk to us a little bit around loss and damage and how the UNFCCC process works. Colin, and also about how the negotiations are being shaped and what are some of the challenges for those processes. Colin, can I turn to you, please?
Good morning. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to be running through a bit of background to the negotiations and what loss and damage is. And I will just share my screen, and I hope you can all see my slides. So yes. As introduced, I'm Colin McQuiston. I'm the head of climate and resilience at Practical Action. And I've been following the negotiations since 2014.
Colin, we seem to have lost you.
Hello?
There you are. You're back. Oh, there seems to be an issue when you move.
Slides are not moving. Okay, great. So loss and damage. Loss and damage is the third pillar of the climate negotiations. People are probably familiar with the mitigation, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. They're probably familiar with the adaptation, the consequences of climate impact and what people can do. But loss and damage is very much the third pillar of the negotiations, and it was a separate article in the Paris Agreement. And it's really focusing on the issues that are probably most important to the humanitarian community, the unavoided and the unavoidable impacts. And this slide really indicates that for many of the impacts that poor communities around the world are facing, in certain circumstances, some of those impacts could be avoided. There are adaptation options, but because we haven't invested at the global scale in sufficient resources in adapting to climate change, many impacts are happening that could otherwise have been avoided. However, what science has really started to highlight is that in many cases, we're facing irreversible impacts. And we're losing coral reefs and we're losing the fisheries upon which they depend, and coastal communities who depend on those fisheries are losing their livelihoods. There's nothing that will bring that back. There's nothing we can do to adapt it. So loss and damage is the consequences of unavoided climate impacts and growing in scale, unavoidable impacts to climate change. And this is a quick overview that the UNFCCC has prepared, and it's available on the website, and I will put the link in the chat box. It gives you that diversity of how loss and damage is manifest around the world. It's related to the slow onset events, the droughts, the sea level rise, the salination of soils, as well as the rapid onset events, those cyclones that are supercharged by climate change, which cause flooding at times of year that otherwise have not faced flooding. And the other thing that's very important about loss and damage is we're not only talking about the economic impacts, we also need to be thinking about the non-economic impacts, the impacts on natural systems, the impacts on culture, the impacts on society, often things that don't get recorded and don't get measured. So in regards to COP27, one of the most important things that will be discussed is where does loss and damage fit into the negotiations? And when loss and damage was first introduced in 2013, it was talking about addressing loss and damage. The language in the Paris Agreement talks more about avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And what this really means is we are covering the entire continuum of development, going from ex-ante action, when an event occurs, emergency response, recovery, disaster risk reduction, and ex-post measures. And of course, it's always really important to remember that those two ends should be connected. After the flood is always before the next flood takes place. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the negotiations, and the negotiations are built up both inside the negotiating halls by the parties, but it's really, really also important to bear in mind that the negotiations have implications and shape the way we live, and therefore have consequences outside the negotiations. And the negotiations have this framing that they're negotiated by the parties who governments negotiate on behalf of, but climate action in and of itself is a whole of society approach. So it must also bear in mind those issues, the positions of civil society, the positions of humanitarian, and of course the positions of the communities that we work with. This is just a very quick timeline of how loss and damage is fitted into the negotiations. As I said, it was first brought in 2013, although the idea, the concept of loss and damage was actually introduced back in 1991. So we got the Water International Mechanism, which is the mechanism that discusses loss and damage. That was then included in the Paris Agreement in 2015. And at COP26, two issues were brought to the fore. The first one is around finance for loss and damage, the need for additional resources. And the second one is technical assistance. And these are just some of the critical issues that we can expect to come up at COP27. So loss and damage is now talked about. There has been the slow progress of the Water International Mechanism on delivering on loss and damage. And therefore, we reached this crunch moment at COP25 in Madrid in 2019 and at COP26 in 2021 in Glasgow, where suddenly the G77 and China said, look, we need action on loss and damage, and we need action on the two things, the two final bullet points on the slide: a technical body, the Santiago Network, and a financing facility. And those are really the challenges going into COP27. And this slide attempts to summarize those critical issues. So the Santiago network, it's the structure, it's how technical assistance is going to be delivered, it's the organizations, bodies, networks, and entities. The UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, loves its acronyms. OBNEs is what they're referred to, but how that technical assistance gets delivered by organizations that are on this call. Where is it hosted? How does it get governed? And what to do with the funds that have already been committed and how to bring in the additional funds, which brings us on to the Glasgow dialogue, which is the issue around how to generate more funding for loss and damage. And then finally, two remaining issues. We have the governance of the Water International Mechanism, whether it falls under the convention or under the agreement, the COP versus the CMA, which is the Conference of Parties to the Convention versus the Conference of Parties to the Paris Agreement. And then we finally have this other issue, which is paragraph 51 of the Paris Agreement decision text, which is almost the we will not be claiming compensation for climate impacts in developing countries. And that's everything from me. I would be more than happy to respond to any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Colin. Before we do pose a question to you, I forgot to introduce our second Menti poll. I apologize, and then I'll come back with a question for you, Colin. The second Menti poll we've got is, what do you think the elements of a common position of humanitarian organizations in those climate negotiations should be? And we can give you you've got a possibility to indicate up to 3 different elements of that common position. And I think, Colin, that point you made about how what is happening outside of the room, so outside of those government negotiations, and that it's this, a whole of society concern that we really need to be looking at, is an important one. Nishani, did you have a follow-up question for Colin, or shall I come up with one?
I have one, actually. So, Colin, one of the questions and what I've been hearing a lot on loss and damage, because I'm also learning about this topic, is that there's no clear targets or clear, guidance on what is really loss and damage and how are we going to address this, and what is that, what's going to happen around loss and damage, and is there a reason behind this, or what is the next steps, and where is COP27 actually placed in this particular area on loss and damage, and what is it that we can do as humanitarian or NGOs in general, at least, to make sure that this loss and damage discussion takes a bit more, a bit more strength and moves forward. Over.
Thank you for that excellent question, Nishani. I think the way that I would answer that question is, at the recent Bonn talks, I met with one of the developed country negotiating teams, and we were talking about making progress on loss and damage. And they recognise there's a lot that is contained within the spectrum of loss and damage. And when we tried to explain, but there are things within the negotiations that are not happening. There are certain pieces of the puzzle that are missing. And the negotiator responded and said, "Oh, I get it. It's the phase between the people living in tents and the insurance payments being delivered." And I heard that and I thought, yes, but because when people are living in tents, they're living in tents because they've lost everything. They have been moved, they have been relocated, they've lost their homes, they've lost their livelihoods. They are totally dependent upon the system. And then they get their insurance payment. That, to me, is several year gap in between. And I think the important thing that civil society and particularly humanitarian agencies need to recognise is, we need to work together with the climate community to emphasise the gaps in the existing system. We need to emphasise within the existing system, there are certain pieces of the puzzle in place, for example, insurance or humanitarian assistance, but they only go so far. They don't cover the full spectrum of impacts that people in developing countries are facing. They don't cover all of the costs. And we need to keep emphasising that there are gaps in the system and that those gaps need to be filled. It's not more early warning systems, but it's turning early warning systems into actionable information that communities can use to reduce their risk, to reduce the threat of climate impact. And it's filling the gaps in the system and not more of the existing pieces of the puzzle. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Colin. Indeed, and this is where the whole aspect of the preparedness levels that we need to put in place as humanitarian action and take more, especially with the communities we work with, refugees, already displaced populations who are extremely vulnerable, and making sure that they're not doubly impacted by climate related disasters that are now happening more and more, and that we're responding to as well. Manisha, you had some points to also continue on, so I will hand over the floor to Manisha. And thanks, Colin, for that. The where we need to focus on. Over.
Thanks, Nishani. I just wanted to. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A column that I thought maybe you could answer. Matilda was asking, has there been a mapping of the countries most affected by climate change on a humanitarian perspective and loss and damage, and with the projections of the numbers of people that have been affected for each of those? That was one, and I'd found one before. Let me start with that one, if that works for you. Sorry.
Okay. I think there are a number of studies that are taking place, and my colleagues on the call can probably talk better to some of those studies. But the one that I would highlight, and I think the study that really raised the profile, particularly of loss and damage, is the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So the IPCC is the science community coming together, assessing the existing literature and looking at the implications of what that means for the planet and the people who live on it. And the report that was published last year, the sixth assessment report, the Working Group 2 report, really documents and brings to the forefront the scale of the losses and damages that are occurring at the global level. And I think it's really, really clear that, A, we're seeing not only an acceleration in the scale of losses and damages, but the losses and damages are impinging on more and more sectors of society. And I think the worries are that because climate change is in many cases unpredictable, it's not linear, it's not a linear progression, it's very unpredictable. We're seeing impacts occurring that were previously not really foreseen. And therefore, we need to work closely with the science community. We need to help them understand the real implications of physical science impact on cultural, social, on human lives. And I think the best assessment we've got is the recent Working Group 2 report, which I think, the link's now in the chat box. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Colin. And thank you for running us through how everything is going to work for COP27. I think that's a great overview. I'm going to maybe turn to the Menti results and then see what others have suggested should be part of those elements of a common position of humanitarian organizations in the climate negotiations. We've got a lot of things. Loss and damage and adaptation are very high up there in terms of what should be the focus, including anticipatory action, equity, displacement. But we've also got a number of other elements in there, including accountability, child participation, community elders, early warning, indigenous. Oh my God, my eyes, man. I think I'm getting old.
Aren't we all? Why do you think I'm in glasses?
I've got contact lenses. I'm just going to move this to my bigger screen. I apologize. Indigenous tribes partners. Sorry, there we go. I should have moved it to my bigger one. Community power, economic stability, sustainability, additional funding, collaboration, displacement. So I think there's a lot of elements there that could become part of any common positions of on the behalf of humanitarian organizations going into those climate negotiations. So I think it might also be helpful now to turn over to Kirsten from IFRC, who's going to give us a little bit of a broader humanitarian perspective, also through the work of the Interagency Standing Committee and how the ISC discussions and that coordinated approach. So what's been done so far, and then also what are some of the questions being asked on humanitarian issues that came up at the Bonn conversations. Kirsten, can I turn over to you, please?
Sure. And lovely to be here. Thanks so much, Manisha and Nishani, for this conversation and for inviting me to be part of it. So maybe just a little bit of a caveat that my background is very much as a humanitarian. I am not in any way a climate scientist. And in fact, like many on this call, I think I'm coming fairly new to the climate world. And I would say like many of us working as humanitarians, I have seen the impacts of climate risks with the more frequent and extreme weather events in the countries where I've worked, but also in my own country. So I'm Australian, if you can't tell by the terrible accent. But my own family was evacuated twice during the 2020 bushfires. A number of their friends lost their houses, but they were lucky not to. And then again, during the floods just this year, we had water lapping at the doorstep. And so this is an issue that is affecting everybody. But of course, it's a very different thing if you're in a country that has a strong social safety net to if you're in a country that is not, or if you're doubly affected by compounded shocks, by conflict, and so on. And I really do believe that humanitarians have an important role to play in the climate conversation and in the conversation around how we should tackle the climate crisis. And so I wanted to talk today a little bit about how humanitarians have engaged with these processes and a few of the opportunities moving forward and bouncing off some of the things that Colin has raised. So from our perspective, and I'm not going to talk through the whole content of the slides. The idea is more to give you some sort of links and resources to go to. But we at the IFRC have been very concerned about the impacts of climate and environmental crises for many years. And we have actually something called the Red Cross Climate Centre, which actually just celebrated its 20-year birthday, shall I say, just this week. And so for us, this has been a priority issue for some 20 years. And we've been present at the UNFCCC COP since around 2001. But I think there's been a far greater humanitarian engagement probably since around 2008, when the IASC set up a task force looking at climate change in particular. And that task force only lasted a couple of years, but they actually produced some fantastic documents. If you look at what they've put together in terms of case studies, in terms of needs, they did a massive assessment of the different needs country by country. They had a letter to the UNFCCC. And if you look at this, you go, actually, a lot of this really does still apply. And I think we were a little bit ahead of our time. Now, that task force, unfortunately, didn't last more than a couple of years, but luckily a number of organisations continued their engagement. And we have Nina from NRC on the call, who's been engaged for many years, or NRC has been involved since 2008. I know they have been working in particular on an informal advisory group around human mobility and climate change for a number of years. And there are other organisations, both international and local and national organisations, that have been really engaged for a number of years. So at the Geneva level or the global level, there's been a few key events and efforts to try and bring the humanitarian community together. So we had the Climate Science Humanitarian Dialogue in 2018, which was this effort to launch the IPCC 1.5 degree report to the humanitarian community and to really raise awareness within the entirety of the humanitarian community that the climate crisis was going to have a massive impact on humanitarian needs and therefore massive impacts for us. And what was fascinating about the response, and we're talking about humanitarian donors, UN agencies, INGOs, national NGOs, was a recognition, I think, yes, this is terrible. We're going to have to deal with the consequences of the climate crisis, but that our main role is to tell governments you need to do better at climate mitigation. And I feel like it took a little while for us to move beyond that to actually say we have a role to play ourselves, both in terms of greening our own operations, in our climate action on the ground, and in our specific advocacy and engagement. And so at the end of 2019, there was the Climate Action Summit, and we reached out to the ISC to see if anyone was interested in common humanitarian messages. And we got really limited response, and it was really quite disappointing. But then something happened, and it was literally a week before the summit that we had, hey, we're interested now. And so after the summit, we actually reached out again, and suddenly there was a massive interest in forming another kind of climate change-related humanitarian group, particularly focused on advocacy. And so we started up an IASC working group specifically looking at the climate crisis and looking at advocacy and engagement in the COP. And this was myself and Kirsten Mildren from OCHA were the co-chairs of the group. And at the HNPW, we had a full room, some 50 people that came together to understand the humanitarian impacts of the climate crisis and then to really come up with a bit of an advocacy work plan. And so over the last couple of years, we put together a common narrative. There was an ISC principles for the COP, and we used it basically as an opportunity just to share information about events and to try and increase engagement of the humanitarian community in some of the climate conversations. And I think that the climate charter itself was actually a huge boost to this process. And I don't know if everybody knows, but we've now reached over 290 signatories just this month, which is pretty exciting. So in terms of COP26, we had a much greater presence of humanitarian organizations. However, the critique that came back to us from the governments there was that we came in a manner that was too individualistic. What they really wanted was more of a humanitarian message than a specific message from different organizations with a common offer. This is our role. This is what we want to do to support, but also a common policy ask. So in terms of a few successes we've had so far that we can build on and then where to go to next. So some of the successes, oops, have I just lost my slide on successes? No. I seem to have lost a slide, but that's okay. So we have a number of successes that have happened in terms of our engagement with the negotiations that I think it's important to build on, thanks to humanitarian engagement. So there has been recognition explicitly in different outcomes documents of disaster risk reduction, of displacement, of extreme events, of early warning, of ideas like risk and vulnerability assessments, of food security as a priority issue as well. We've had some specific wins around recognition of anticipatory action as an important tool for managing climate risks. And then I would say, as was mentioned just now by Colin, the IPCC report gives us a really important new entry point. So we've been saying there are humanitarian impacts to climate change for years, but this report means that we have all the governments of the world and the scientists of the world are firmly agreeing with that and saying that there really are humanitarian impacts. And so we need to leverage that. So in terms of some of the messaging, I've put up a slide that lists all of the messaging that has come out of the IASC. And I think there's probably the four main points are the ones at the beginning, that we're already seeing the humanitarian impacts of the crisis, that we know more must be done in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions because we're really concerned about what worst case scenarios could look like in terms of humanitarian action, that much, much more has to be done to scale up urgent action to support resilience and adaptation and investment in DRR at the local level, and in particular around maintaining a focus on the most vulnerable and those being left behind. And having sat in some of the conversations at the UNFCCC negotiations, it's very clear that that is often forgotten. The conversations are about money and they're about infrastructure and they're about approaches. And you miss the idea that this is actually something that is destroying lives and livelihoods and that our priority must be around saving lives and livelihoods. So at the most recent meetings in Bonn, it was very clear that there was a particular opportunity now. There is a particular interest in understanding humanitarian work. Ooh, and Manisha is saying, hurry up and close, so I will do so. So there's a real interest in understanding humanitarian work, and in particular when it comes to loss and damage, but there is an assumption that our role is only around response. So I think what we really need to be engaging in is explaining how there is a humanitarian role in the whole process of what they call avert, minimize, and address loss and damage, or what we would see as the disaster risk management cycle, but also to say that we as humanitarians can't do it all. We don't have the capacity, we don't have the funding, and it's just going to be well beyond us. So in terms of just to wrap up in terms of the past successes, there's a couple of things that I think it's important to think of as we look at our engagement over the coming year. So the first I would say is it's a long process. The COP isn't just one event, it's actually a series of negotiations throughout the year. And it matters, as Colin showed in his slide, what is being said outside the COP in terms of developing the narrative and those ongoing negotiations. So it's a long haul and it requires a significant amount of engagement. Second piece I would say is engagement at the national level is crucial. All of these negotiators are also national governments, and the national level is where we're really going to see impact. The third point I would say is language. We really need to learn the climate language and learn to speak their language and translate our own concepts into their language. And then the final one, and this is reiterated, I think, by the message from Jasmine, is they really want specific asks from the humanitarian community. So we need to come with a strong, coherent humanitarian voice, talking about humanitarian needs, clarifying our role, and being really clear on the action that we want to see and that we expect from policymakers. So thanks, and sorry for going over time, Manisha.
Thanks very much, Kirsten. And I think it is a bit sad that we had that IAC task force like 12 years ago or 14 years ago, and that it's taken us this long to really understand all the different impacts that are happening before we're really starting to pay attention and engage in those processes. But as you said, there are some that have stayed engaged. So thank you to those who've stayed engaged throughout. Before we ask you some questions, Kirsten, I forgot to launch the next Mentimeter poll, so let me do that. We've got, and Vaughn will share the link in a second. What is the added value of humanitarian organizations engaging in climate negotiations? And Kirsten's given you some ideas already, as did Colin, but we would love to hear your thoughts on that. So please, you can enter up to 3 again in terms of what you think is the added value of humanitarian organizations engaging in climate negotiations. Vaughn might have actually pasted that already, but it'll be in the chat in a second, so you can go there, or it's in the same Mentees where you were already before that. Nishani, do you want to ask Kirsten any questions, or shall I?
Yes, I have a few questions that are kind of, it's a little bit of a mishmash because there's quite a few commonalities on some of them. And Kirsten, one of the things that we keep hearing and being asked from our participants is, how are we engaging communities? Because they're kind of the ones who are lost. They're the ones who are most affected, obviously. And this is what we're really talking about. But how are they being engaged in these big processes like the COP27, where there's even NGOs have really hard space to get there and be part of these conversations. Now we've got machinery, right? But how is that happening? And do you have any specific cases where the IFRC is connecting with your communities at ground level to make sure that this information is actually brought up at these discussions? Over.
So I think that's a really good question and a big challenge. There is a specific process or a body within the COP or within the UNFCCC, I should say, that focuses on Indigenous communities and community level engagement. What's interesting about that, though, is it's relatively easy to define Indigenous communities, and the Indigenous communities who are engaged in the COP process are quite well organised, whereas the non-Indigenous communities is everyone. And so that's been very difficult, I think, for the UNFCCC to actually work out how to bring in those community voices and when and where. And we've seen in some other global processes like the Global Refugee Forum, the idea of bringing refugees to have their voices. And so I think that this is I think it's a challenging nut to crack when you have this whole process of how to be accepted and how to be engaged, and then this communities forum that hasn't really worked out how to do that. And so I actually think that forum is looking for concrete proposals on how to better engage communities when that is everybody in the world. So how do you do that? Do you pick particular issues and have communities from, people from particular communities address and so on? So I think that's one opportunity for engagement. And I was talking at the UNFCCC Bonn meetings to the person who's about to take over that process, who was saying, yeah, we're really actually keen on ideas, and this is an absolute challenge. I think there's another piece is around locally led adaptation action. So there are now these principles on locally led adaptation, which talks about the role of local communities in implementation. But if you compare that objective and these principles that many international organizations and governments have signed up to with the reality, particularly when you talk about funding and programming more than advocacy, you'll see that the vast majority of funding, of course, goes to governments. However, in terms of some good practices, I'd say a lot of those have been at the national level. So you have the process of developing NDCs, national determined contributions, and national adaptation plans. And so in some countries, there have been really consistent efforts to engage local affected communities in the design of those plans. And that's something where we've had some experience because some of our national societies have actually played a role in facilitating some of those conversations. And so for us, it's particularly important because, for example, how do you actually design an early warning system if you don't do it in consultation with the communities that will actually be the ones implementing it, to be honest? So I think it's a really important question. I think engaging in that national process is probably the best way, because realistically, there's not the funding. It will have a huge impact on the climate. If we're flying, entire communities to the COP is not realistic. So finding a way through the national system, I think, is going to be super important.
Thanks, Kirsten. And you answered a few other questions of, how are the process of the national level processes, what's happening. And of course, there's right now, there's quite a lot of issues related to economic crisis, right? And are NDCs funded then is another question. We will, I think, have to discuss that in another whole conversation. But I think one more point to you is the mapping that was done on climate affected communities, perspectives, loss and damage. I think, IFRC has some of that information as well. Maybe if you have a link, perhaps over to you.
So we didn't do a mapping of affected communities' perspective on loss and damage. There's a couple of things that happened. So one, there was the ISC mapping before loss and damage was even a thing, really, on just in terms of needs and ideas. So definitely have a look on the ISC website. That was done back in 2008, though. So obviously it's changed and expanded since then. What we did with the World Disasters Report was this mapping of climate vulnerable countries. So I saw the question that was put up on the Q&A, but it's now gone, so in addition to the IPCC report, which was much more a scientific approach, and sort of a review of all the scientific literature, there's the ND GAIN index. So that's the University of Notre Dame has got the GAIN index, which looks specifically at an assessment of climate vulnerability of countries. And so climate vulnerability is not only exposure to shocks, but it's also the capacity to manage them, or exposure to climate risks and the capacity to manage those risks. And then there's also the INFORM index, which a lot of humanitarians will be more familiar with, that maps disaster risks. And they have a specific climate lens or a climate window, I guess. I'm using not quite the right terminology, but a climate filter. That's what I'm looking for. So you can actually filter through climate risk. And so when we put together the 2020 World Disasters Report, that specifically combined those two to identify what we saw as some of the most climate vulnerable countries. And what was super interesting about that is you compare high levels of climate vulnerability to climate adaptation funding on a per person version, and they're not matched at all. So, for example, what we saw is the five to eight highest vulnerability countries had some of the lowest amounts of climate adaptation funding. And one of the reasons is that because a number of them are fragile or conflict affected. And so big development funds, big climate funds don't easily or naturally go to the governments of fragile and conflict affected countries, which means we need to find another way to get climate adaptation or DRR funding into those countries because they are also affected. And I can put the link to the WDR in the chat if somebody hasn't already done that.
Perfect. Thanks. And Manisha, over to you, because we've got a mentee.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Kirsten. And we do have the results from that mentee poll on what is the added value of humanitarian organizations engaging in climate negotiations. Vulnerability perspective, humanitarian principles, amplifying local voices, field perspective, first responders' presence on the ground, community participation, collective action. I think there's also lots of other suggestions there in terms of informed action, advocacy to donors, considering human life, indigenous communities, getting strong commitment, greening our own operations as well. NGOs are as stakeholders, looking at the human development, as well. So I think there's a lot of elements there that provided added value for humanitarian organizations really engaging in those climate negotiations outside of the room, as was mentioned before. And I think, as you mentioned, Kirsten, we're often seeing the impacts of climate change in our day-to-day operations as humanitarian actors. So I think it's incredibly important that we bring that collective voice. And as you said, Kirsten, that we don't do it in that individualistic approach that we've had in previous COPs. So something there for us to consider. So thanks very much, Kirsten, for that. I'm going to next turn over to Nina, please. And Nina, you're going to talk a little bit about the human mobility perspectives for COP27, I believe, and also, the importance of that in terms of loss and damage as well in those discussions. So Nina, can I turn to you, please? You're on mute, Nina.
Then I should be possible to hear. No, so thank you. I think first of all, I will try to end in COP27 and going forward, but I'll also go a little bit backwards because as Kirsten said, how do we work with this machinery of the UNFCCC, the climate change negotiations? Because it's a huge process. You have lots of people having full-time jobs engaging. And I think most of us who come from humanitarian organizations, we do it with maybe our little finger now and then the question is how can we do more? But I think also very much as we heard from everyone today, how do we do it together? Because there's no way each organization could or should do this alone. We need to do it as a sector together. And I think this is where I also share a little bit of the experience we've had as NRC when we worked from the displacement specific angle. Because for us, as Kirsten said, we started engaging back in 2007-8 with the climate change negotiations. And that came very much from two perspectives. One was that we saw that climate change have a severe impact on people that are displaced, but we also saw that more and more people are being displaced linked to the impacts of climate change, so through disasters. So for those of you who follow the displacement discussion, you will know that our internal displacement monitoring center have produced data on disaster displacement since 2008. And what we have seen over these years is that people being displaced by disasters and the impacts of climate change has usually been 2, 3, 4 times as many every year as from conflict. And I'm not going to put up a battle about which is more important because of figures, but it's a big issue. But I think what we forgot very long as a humanitarian sector is actually the impact on everyone that we work with as humanitarian organizations, so the most vulnerable. And I think this is where how do we now get active and move into the climate change negotiations together to try to make sure that we can share our expertise, but also, which I think is often new to many of us, is not waiting until it happens, but really how can we be prepared and prevent and adapt and do anticipatory action. So when we started to work on disaster displacement, we realized that it's not when it happens. We need to be much more active in the climate change space, with disaster risk reduction, to be able to convince those working on those areas why they should look on human mobility, which includes displacement. I will not go through this whole slide, but basically show that it's been an ongoing process for many years. The issue of human mobility, which includes migration, displacement, and planned relocation, have been on the agenda of the climate change negotiations. I want to make one point, which I think also helps us, how do we do advocacy and policy work on the wider humanitarian, is that if you look at this one slide, and in 2010, there was a first concrete reference to displacement in the climate change negotiations. It was under this term that's become quite popular now called human mobility, which at that time didn't mean much to many. And I think that's also why it got in, because people say, oh, human mobility, that's fine, we will include that. I think if we had said displacement, migration, planned relocation, this is not climate change, that's something else. So I think this is a little bit what Kirsten also said, how to use a language which is understandable and acceptable in this negotiation, which is a negotiation word by word. So human mobility got in, and then that made the space to talk about displacement from our perspective, but from other partner organizations, also, of course, migration and planned relocation. So I think we had big hopes when we went to Paris, and we thought that, no, we will get it in. And we had a lot of good feedback from many parties, the governments, both from developing and developed countries, both the emitters and those most affected. In 2015, we also had a so-called refugee crisis in Europe. And what happened was that those delegations have been quite keen to include the human mobility. Said, this is becoming too politically sensitive. We can't really talk about climate change and human mobility in the same. So in Paris, what we had hoped to be part of the Paris Agreement, human mobility was kept thanks to the G77 and countries that pushed for loss and damage, but it was kept in a next layer of decisions. So I won't spend more time on it, but I just kind of show that it's been more than 10 years trying to bring it to the table. And in Paris, it was established a task force on displacement. So it's one formal piece in there. But how do we make sure it's not just that task force, but this goes through the whole negotiation? So human mobility in the loss and damage discussion. I think it's maybe the easiest part of the climate change negotiation to say that if you talk about people fleeing or people migrating, it is part of loss and damage, because as we heard, this is when adaptation and mitigation doesn't work. What do we then deal with? But I think also we shouldn't only focus on that, even though that's a big issue now, because it has to be part of everything. And in the same way as when we talk about displacement in the context of climate change, we can't only look to the climate change negotiations. As we heard from others, we need to look at other policy frameworks as well, because this is a whole complicated process. So we need to have the wins in many policy processes. And again, here, how do we then work together as a humanitarian sector, not only to climate change, but also related other policy areas? So we already started discussing what can humanitarian NGOs bring. And I think what we very much need to bring is our expertise with humanitarian issues. The climate change negotiators doesn't know humanitarian issues. They care about them when we tell them, but they don't know it. So we need to really translate, as Kirsten said, if they don't do better, have a more impact of the decisions, that they really have the commitments that states make, etc., we need to pick it up. And easy for us as a humanitarian sector, but imagine the people living it is much worse. I mean, that, as we say, they don't even get to the table. So how do we put our technical expertise together? And I think what we really want to focus on is, what does the lack of action, what does the lack of implementation of commitments and good language mean in reality for people? And my key word here is we need to do this together. Because as we heard, that's what the negotiators need. But I also think if we effectively should use our resources to change the situation, we need to work together. And I think this is also what we've seen on the work on displacement. It's together with others and in alliances, we've been able to keep it moving and have some wins along the way. Kirsten mentioned that we've had for several years this informal advisory group on climate change and human mobility, which is a group of UN organizations, NGO, research institutes coming together. So we're trying to then produce joint common messaging that we've gone to the negotiators. When we had more resources, we've been able to give them concrete text. This is what you should put in this and this discussion. And when we have had less resources, it's been more just at least have awareness around the issue. I think also for displacement, we've had a unique opportunity because you have something called a platform on disaster displacement, which is a state-led process where you also have UN and NGOs coming together and also research institutes. So you have also a forum focusing on that issue where you can also get states to take your message forward and not just come as a outsider to the negotiators. We've also seen that it's been super important to work very closely with a strong civil society network within the climate change negotiation, the Climate Action Network, because they are the one who really knows and works this process. So if we can get them to help us to bring our messaging, it's much more effective than us coming in and trying to do it alone. So another thing I was asked to say a few words about is, who do we need to advocate with? And I think this is back to what Kirsten said about the last COP, where we had a lot of us being present, but did we really speak with and try to influence those we should influence, or were there more to be seen and have our press conferences? And the negotiators is, of course, the key. Those are the ones who make the decisions and who do the negotiations. And as we heard, it's not just at the COP, but how do we do it before? And as we discussed, how do we then get an interaction with negotiators on the national level ahead of each COP, ahead of each meeting? And I think this is where we need to work much more closer together between international, national NGOs and civil society to kind of make sure that the negotiating team from each country pick up the humanitarian, pick up the displacement issues and bring it to COP and are familiar with it. I think also we need to make sure that those many organizations who are the kind of ones working on climate change full-time, they need to understand the humanitarian issues. If we can explain it well, I'm sure they will pick it up and take it forward because it's clear. But again, as negotiators, they don't have the expertise. We need to bring that to the table. The same to donors and also all the technical experts that are advising countries and different processes in this. And then
Nina, I'm going to get you to do the last couple slides a bit quicker.
This is the last slide. So that's
wonderful.
That's good. So my question is again, how do we advocate? And I think what we really need to do is start to work much more as a sector. How do we give the language to negotiators that they can use? So because they're busy, they have hundreds of sectors trying to get their issue in. So how do we come and provide this? So that is again coming together with a joint messaging and making sure that we have the trust and we have the entry points. And there's many ways to do this. And if you look at the number of people on this calls, I think you can see a lot of people who have very different access. Just one concrete example, I saw there were colleagues from Coast, Bangladeshi NGO here, and they have always had very close relationship and being able to influence the Bangladesh delegation on migration, human mobility, and displacement. So again, how can we do this much more with many more countries? We have all those different things we can do that I put on the slide, but I think we really need to focus on working on the text and not just do the events that we can easily control ourselves. I'm not saying we shouldn't do those, but we shouldn't stop with those. And then one of the ways we have been able to get access to negotiators is using and working with artists. So trying to make sure that we can bring the message with a spin that is not the kind of typical way that the negotiator get someone to try to make them to say it. So some of the photos you have on this slide is from Marrakesh and the COP there, where we had an artist who had made a floating island, and then we got the negotiators to help carry this. And then we had 50 seconds, 1 minute, when they walked from one venue to the other to talk about their issue. So again, how to engage artists and not just look at, but really make policy change. So I will stop there because my time has already went out, but thank you.
Thanks very much, Nina. And I think those are some really great practical things that we can be doing in the lead up to COP. But I think that point really around getting text to some of those negotiators is something that would be really keen. And I guess as a follow-up there, how do we get common text that we can, use across different countries at the national level? Like, what's the process for us as humanitarians to get that language that would be understandable for them, that impact that they need to get, and that they can really just turn into text? Like, is there a common document online or something that we are all contributing to with, text that can be passed on to negotiators?
I think this is where we need to make sure that what happened around the advocacy group under ISC continues, because you already there have quite a few humanitarian organizations together. And we now have a short half year before the next COP. So how do we then come together, have some joint messaging? I think also what we have done is that with all the joint messaging we did as the advisory group, we never put logos. And that helps with sign off, but it also helps that this is about the issue and not about branding. So I think this is also one thing we have done, and it makes it easier for more organizations to contribute what they can without necessarily being expert on everything. So how can we, and I think this is where ICWA can play a very important role, but also, of course, in collaboration with other NGO networks. So how do we come together on this? And then I think really it's not just NGOs coming together, but we need to have the UN with us. We need to have all the researchers with us. We need to get more civil society. And I think doing it in an informal, open process is easier than try to set up a framework, because then we get stuck on the bureaucracy instead of the messaging. I think we really can use the fact that more than 200 organizations have signed on to the charter, the Climate and Environment Charter, because we have also a commitment in there. So how do we use some of these instruments that are already there and then come forward? It won't be perfect for COP27, but if we can do there, we can then improve for the next COPs. And then everyone can contribute what they can, and that collective is much bigger than each of us trying to have our perfect messaging alone.
Super. Thanks very much for that, Nina. And Nishani, did you have a question, or can I move on to the next Menti pool and then to Lindsay, because we're running a bit short on time?
I know. I just have one quick question, Nina. I mean, with such a lot of messaging going on the humanitarian sector and on human mobility, what is the key advocacy message that that we need to share more widely with the community on climate change and the negotiators? Is there one big topic, a big calling point that we have, and what would that be, is my question. And also, yes, absolutely, what you mentioned about, how ICWA as a network of NGOs and communities bringing together, we're definitely looking at towards the next COP. This is one of these opportunities to have this discussion and look at next steps. We will share definitely widely all these communications that are coming in on key messages. So quick one on that one. Sorry, Nina.
No, I think as a humanitarian sector, one thing we need to be strong in messaging is that, yes, you need to pick up the humanitarian issues and use us, but don't think that you resolve loss and damage by saying that you as humanitarian sector do it, the DRR people do it, because the funding and the resources we have is just the tip of the iceberg in this. There needs to be additional resources on the table to deal with loss and damage. And then we're not even talking about the compensation, but the issues facing us day by day. So I think the finance is probably the strongest message we need to come jointly into. And then, of course, around anticipatory action. Thank you.
Thanks. And that leads extremely well to Lindsay, but I will let Manisha do the Menti and then move on to Lindsay.
Thanks very much. And thank you, Nina, for that. I think some very practical suggestions of how we can move forward. So that's excellent. I'm going to launch our fourth Menti poll before I turn to Lindsay. And here we're asking, how relevant is loss and damage advocacy towards COP27 to your work or your organization? And you can go from it's very important to not important at all. So we'll leave that up. And with that, I'm going to turn to Lindsay from Oxfam, who is going to be focusing a bit on a recent report called Footing the Bill, but also how that, which is related to loss and damage finance, but also how that applies to humanitarian actors. So Lindsay, can I turn to you, please?
Nina, thanks for setting me up. So I'm Lindsay, and thanks for having me here. I'm a climate policy advisor with Oxfam Great Britain, and I'm going to present on loss and damage finance and a recent paper that Oxfam recently published on the topic. So yeah, just to say as a reminder, a lot of people have spoken about it, but loss and damage is a term that can be confusing, but it basically refers to impacts of climate change that cannot or have not been adapted to. And it can refer to loss of lives, livelihoods, homes, and damage to things like roads, buildings, farming outputs, among other things. And it can also be economic, meaning you can attach a monetary value to it, or non-economic, meaning it isn't traded on markets. So it's difficult to attach a monetary value to it. So say if you lost something like a family photograph in a flood, you can take more photos, but you can't really truly replace that same photo. So yeah, when policymakers kind of speak about loss and damage in climate negotiations, they often use this term avert, minimize, and address loss and damage, which can again be confusing. So averting is basically reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in the first place, so stopping climate change. Minimizing is essentially adaptation, so reducing impacts of climate change before they hit. And addressing is addressing the impacts of climate change after they hit. So currently, if you want to hook homes up to renewables or build a flood defense in the face of rising sea levels, there is finance to do this, but by no means enough under international agreement. But if a home is washed away in a flood or rising seas, you're pretty much left on your own. This is the big missing piece of the puzzle. And it means that people are essentially left to foot the bill themselves once climate impacts have actually hit. So there's no support under the international climate architecture for this. And this is where the big push for loss and damage finance is aimed at. It's finance to address it. So Oxfam's recent paper gives kind of further evidence that the humanitarian system is really struggling to keep up with these escalating climate impacts. The research underpinning our new paper looked at UN humanitarian appeals linked to extreme weather over the past 2 decades, basically as an indicator of rising climate impacts and of the loss and damage being experienced. So we found that the money needed for these appeals linked to extreme weather is 8 times higher than what it was 20 years ago. So that's over an 800% increase. And then with the rising needs, the funding shortfalls have obviously also increased. So in the past 5 years, appeals were only funded around 54% on average, basically meaning that for every $2 needed by low and middle income countries, they got around $1 to respond to these events. So we estimate that over the past 5 years, this led to a shortfall of up to $33 billion. And this trend obviously isn't just for extreme weather appeals, it's common for UN appeals across the board to only be funded by half or even less, unfortunately. And then this figure is really just showing that even if it were fully funded, as Nina did say, the humanitarian system would nowhere be meeting the scale of need to address loss and damage fully. UN appeals obviously represent just a small part of the costs of climate disasters. So fully funding the humanitarian system, while crucial, it won't address all loss and damage. It won't address the impacts in the medium to long term after an event. And it isn't designed to address slower onset processes like sea level rise. And then, all of this is just to say that we really need new and additional finance that is dedicated to addressing loss and damage to ensure the full spectrum is covered. So it does include humanitarian assistance, but it should also cover things like rebuilding schools and other vital infrastructure, providing social protection, providing finance to support the safe and dignified movement of people forced to migrate, building alternative livelihoods. So say if farming is no longer a viable option in your area because the soil has become too salinized from sea level intrusion. And then also measures to address non-economic loss and damages. So this can be things like investing in cultural heritage or setting up active remembrance like museums to make sure that non-economic loss and damage is respected. And also addressed. So and also just to say, this is by no means a new ask. As Colin said, over 30 years ago, small island states asked for this to be included in the actual drafting of the UNFCCC. And every year concrete action is delayed. It just means more loss and damage that isn't addressed. So kind of key asks that we as Oxfam have for COP27, but I think are very relevant to everyone, is most importantly to make every effort to kind of stay within 1.5 degrees. And this means countries need to come back with new 2030 plans with their emissions reduction targets in line with 1.5. So developed countries basically promised in 2009 that they would deliver 100 billion per year to developing countries by 2020 for mitigation and adaptation projects. As of last year, it didn't look like this 100 billion was met. It doesn't seem like it will be met this year either. So that's 3 years late. So the goal really needs to be met as soon as possible. And also half of this 100 billion should be going towards adaptation projects and in the form of grants, not loans. And then lastly, as outlined, we want parties to agree to a loss and damage finance facility. So in the words of UNFCCC, avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. So just some key messages for humanitarians. And I'm sorry if I'm going over a little bit, but this is just a recent table taken from one of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Changes, IPCC. Yes, I know there's lots of acronyms. Most recent reports, and it just shows the frequency of once in a decade weather events under different warming scenarios. So we're currently at 1.1, and you can just see there, say take droughts at 1.5, there'll be two times as frequent, 2 degrees, 2.4. It just goes up and up and up. And I think that table really exemplifies this. And it's just really making the point that every fraction of a degree of warming really does matter. So even if people on this call haven't been involved in COPs, haven't tried to influence them, their outcomes have affected you as an organization, but also obviously as an individual. They create new and compound crises, and they just create a much more difficult environment for humanitarians to work within. When climate finance goals aren't met, it means less money for adaptation, leading to more loss and damage that humanitarians have to respond to, as communities don't have the means often to adequately adapt to a changing climate. And then, just to highlight the current warming projections, if you put together all the kind of plans for 2030, put us on track for 2.4 degrees of warming. And that's assuming the plans are fulfilled. So without finance, new and additional finance to address loss and damage that's mobilized really on the basis of responsibility for who caused the crisis, the humanitarian system is just going to end up being more and more overstretched and left to foot the bill itself. And yeah, just say I think it's really important to have more humanitarian voices and perspectives in and around the climate negotiations. And hopefully this presentation has made the case as to why loss and damage finance is something that is relevant for you too. So thank you. And apologies, my technical expertise is not up to scratch.
No worries. Thanks so much, Lindsay. And I think you've painted a really kind of stark and a little bit, if I may say, a little bit depressing of a picture about, really how humanitarians are, we're not being able to meet the needs and the needs are just increasing, and how that's really continuing along these days. And there was a question for you, Lindsay. Out of that 100 billion that hasn't been met yet, how much has actually been delivered? Maybe I'll let you answer that one if you got the answer for that.
Yes, we do. So I don't work on this specifically, but Oxfam does publish this thing called the Climate Finance Shadow Report, where they look at the data that's been submitted by donor countries towards this 100 billion and looks at how much, compared to what they've actually said they've committed and put forward, how much is actually being put forward solely for the purpose of climate change, climate projects, and also how much is in the form of grants. So the way it works is like we will be getting the data this year in 2022 for 2018 to 2020. So that's just the way it works. So the last data we have in the last report was on 2017 to 2018. And of that, there was 60 billion was reported in public climate finance. But of that was just specific to climate change. We estimated it was between 19 and 22.5 billion. And only 25% of all that was reported was for adaptation specifically, and around 20% was grants. So that just paints a picture that a lot of it's being provided as in non-grant form, which is obviously just more placing the risk of a debt burden on these countries to face a crisis they really did not contribute to.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it is a bit it's telling how little is going in terms of grants and just financing in general towards climate change, and yet defense spending is huge in comparison. I mean, and that also is probably not helping us with our keeping to that target of 1.5 with all the military industrial complex selling all its weapons and bombs and flying planes. So yeah, I kind of feel like sometimes there's a lot of advocacy that needs to be done a kind of across. I mean, also in terms of, the peace movement would also probably be helpful in terms of really pushing towards more peace, less weapons would also help us with climate change, I imagine, too. But Ms. Shani, I'm going to turn over to you.
Lindsay, you hit a bit of that, issues that we've been facing, and one of the things that we've been getting as questions also on climate, on financing on loss and damage is that with the funding available, you already mentioned that there's already very little going into adaptation, and already the pot is on grants, and it's not actually going towards the right spaces, perhaps. And this is very big international funding we're talking about, but how is it really reaching the community level who are the most vulnerable? And that's, I think, the other question that's been asked. Is it a trickle down effect? Where is it that, how does that reach communities who are really in need? And then how is it that us humanitarian actors what's the role that we need to play in this climate finance or loss and damage financing? And where is it that we need to advocate is my other question to you. Over.
Yeah, well, I think it is pretty clear that a lot of the climate finance really isn't reaching local communities in the way that we'd like to, for a variety of reasons, not least because of the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, which would distribute a lot of this finance. It's quite bureaucratic and difficult to access for smaller organizations. And it also, it basically funds projects. So yeah, it's very bureaucratic to then apply for the funding process. So it's definitely not reaching the local level, but there has been a big push on locally led adaptation within UNFCCC. And I think it's really interesting to kind of draw the parallel to local humanitarian leadership, which I know has been a big thing within the humanitarian space. So it's like we're all talking, we all know what needs to be done. It's just difficult to then try and get that to the local level. But yeah, I mean, as Kirsten said as well, when you look at that ND gain index and you look at how much of finance is going to conflict affected regions, it's really just not reaching there. And this obviously just then exacerbates vulnerability to climate related like security risks, and then just increases the costs of adaptation over time. We definitely need to push for more of that funding to go to the local level and go to local actors and not kind of be caught up in these bigger institutions. And sorry, what was your second question?
Is what do we need to advocate for then? How and what is that key message that we want to take forward?
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. I think it's what a lot of people have said before, is developing this kind of joint messaging on, well, for me, a big focus is loss and damage, but just climate justice in general. It was interesting on one of the first mentees, I think I saw, it was like loss and damage adaptation, but equity was in there as well. And I think that's such a core part of what we really need to be pushing under the UNFCCC. So I think to do that, yeah, I mean, spaces like this are amazing where we kind of bring these two worlds of climate and humanitarian together that can be very siloed. So we just need more of that, more for knowledge sharing. I mean, what people said before for, I think humanitarians emphasizing those gaps in the existing systems for addressing loss and damage is really important. I think also climate people can be very, we use very technical and neutral language sometimes. And I think humanitarians really bring that human side of it, which is so important, especially around the negotiations. Just really remind people what they're actually doing this for. Like, why are we engaging with the COP? It's for people, right? And then also all the technical expertise. But I think, yeah, joint messaging on loss and damage finance particularly would be really powerful. And developing like a common language that we can both use to try and break down those silos would perhaps be a first step. But the basis of the messaging is just really what I outlined there, is just the fact that loss and damage is already adding to the already huge caseload for humanitarians. This is only going to increase, make it more difficult for the work you guys do, and that more money is needed to respond, and that clearly needs to come on the basis of responsibility. I mean, just one, I think it was, sorry, I'm definitely talking too long, but Jasmine at the beginning was saying that, you know, Africa is responsible for 4% of current emissions, and high income countries are responsible, I think, for 30% of current. But if you look at historical excess emissions that bring us over a safe level of warning, some people estimate it's 92%. So it's just clear. I mean, when you just bring it down to the numbers, who should be paying to address that loss and damage, and it shouldn't be the humanitarian system.
And absolutely, you hit the nail on the head when we had OCHA in one of our previous webinars on looking at climate risk and data. And one of the statistics that they had come up with on looking at taking an analysis of all the SURF funding that was going in, 80% of SURF funding were actually going to respond to climate related impacts, which were also beyond HRP, and climate change was not even mentioned in our analysis or needs analysis. There's this huge gap that we're seeing, of course, even in analysis and being prepared for it in the sector itself, in the humanitarian sector. But at the same time, most of our funding is going to response, which is not part of our preparedness plans, and it's additional funding that we are really now using beyond the normal conflict context, complex emergency context, and on top of already increasing humanitarian need. And maybe Nina, you just typed in on the Green Climate Fund, and maybe you want to jump in on that if there's something that you'd like to add on this question. Over.
No, I think when it comes to the Green Climate Fund, I think many of us, when it was put out some years back, said, yes, this is a way where we can also do our work as humanitarian organization with climate funding. And we as NRC, we tried to look into it, and we realized the cost of getting access to that is much higher than the funding we would ever get. So it's not financially worth it, and the complications. And I think even UN organizations that have even bigger and often easier access to funding than NGOs, many of them couldn't really get it either. So I think where we can get access to it as humanitarian actors is very much how do we work with the governments who do get it. But I think also we need to be very clear about the governments that really need it is not getting it, because so this is part of the challenge, is that funding is there. I think it's many donors who are more keen to give money there to the humanitarian sector. So we kind of have that competition between sectors. But then is that money really reaching the most vulnerable and those at the heart of the climate crisis? And I think definitely no. So this is why I think also in the whole discussion around loss and damage and finding, how is humanitarian work one part of it, where we also need to be able to, we need to make sure that we work in a way that is eligible. We can't just say give the money to us and not then adapt to work with a proper climate change focus. But when we do, how can we then also access this money in a way to both prevent and be prepared, and also respond and try to find solutions to people who are impacted by the climate crisis? And those are many.
And maybe I'd like to reach to Kirsten and Colin both, because I know IFRC has been looking through at how are we accessing this sort of climate financing a little bit more. I mean, we will have another webinar totally on this, but just for us as humanitarians, it would be really interesting to hear how that's happening with the Red Cross movement. And Colin, like with the whole Santiago network implementation, or well, at least setting up of it, where does that sit with where would that sit with humanitarian NGOs or organizations and actors? The intersection between the climate financing and humanitarian financing. Do you have some idea that you could, share with us? Over.
Do you want me to jump in first? So I think there are a lot of pieces to that question, and there's also a lot of different sources of finance that are relevant. I think one of the challenges is, particularly if you're talking about a humanitarian context, you go to your traditional humanitarian donor and you're like, we want to do disaster risk reduction work in country X. And they're like, that's not our stuff. That's not sufficiently humanitarian. Then you go to the development people and they're like, but that's a humanitarian context. We don't deal with that. And so you find these countries that are completely falling, or the things that need to happen in certain countries that are not happening because the donors are working in silos and they're not coming together to identify there's a problem and we need to fix it. And that's just with our traditional donors. Then when you talk to the big climate funds, as Lindsay was explaining, it's incredibly difficult. There are very few non-governmental organizations or indeed UN agencies and so on who have actually managed to access some of these funds. What we've been doing is often working in collaboration with others that do have access to the funds, including governments, and recognizing that the national societies, National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, have a slightly different role and function as auxiliaries to the government than do NGOs, but there are definitely some lessons learned there in terms of collaboration with the government on how to get funds to the local level. And as I think I mentioned earlier, one of the areas we've been trying to do that in particular is around early warning systems, because there's been a fantastic scale up, I think, of interest and investment around forecasting capacities. And you would have heard the UN Secretary General's commitment that we're going to have everybody covered by early warning systems. The challenge with that is if you just have the forecasting capacity and an early warning that goes out, that actually doesn't save lives. In order for it to save lives, the message needs to get to the community in a language that they understand, and they need to be ready with an action plan, with action that is actually funded and can practically happen in order to do whatever it is that is needed, be it to evacuate to higher ground, to identify the most vulnerable people and help them. Like, is there a bus? Is there an evacuation center? Like, all of these basic things have to be in place. Every single piece of the chain for a life to actually be saved. And so that's where what we've been really advocating for is this collaborative approach between government and local communities. The third piece I think that is worth just flagging is that even if
we dramatically scaled up funding humanitarians, we still couldn't manage this ourselves. And so for me, tying into what Nina said around the importance of scaling up the funding that is available, and I would say for all pieces of avert, minimize, and addressing loss and damage, because the more you invest in the adaptation piece and the DRR, the less you're going to need to be investing in the address or respond piece. But that needs to just be going in as many different channels as possible to as many different organizations, communities, etc., as possible in order to be able to meet the needs. And so we know there are communities left out, we know there are countries left out, and unless there is a diversification of processes and of channels for funding and of sources and so on, then we're never going to actually come up with a holistic kind of approach to this. And the climate funds are insanely difficult to access. So talking to the lead negotiator from IOSIS, which is the Association of Small Island States, he was talking about this 200-page application that took 2 years to get through. They only accepted 1 out of 4 projects. And when you have that kind of thing, it's like, how is that actually going to ever save lives or deal with the person that, you know, as was described earlier, is the person that's sitting there in the tent, what Colin was talking about, and who actually needs something urgently. So there has to be the humanitarian piece, fast funding, small amounts, local organizations addressing immediate needs, the big climate finance piece, big projects, government level, major infrastructure, and so on. But there also has to be something in the middle. And I think it's the something in the middle that is actually what's missing, that's tying it all together.
Thanks, Kasan. That's really interesting insights onto kind of the gaps. But Colin, what about any insights from you on that linkages and the gaps or the missing piece, or what do we need to do to advocate, or how are we getting involved as humanitarian actors?
I don't think I have a lot to add to what Kirsten's just said. That was an excellent answer. I mean, I think we've got this opportunity that at COP27 we will be discussing the form, function, the structure, the hosting of the Santiago Network. The Santiago Network is this thing that was agreed in Madrid at COP25 as a missing piece of the puzzle. I don't think it's going to solve all of the challenges and problems that we've identified, but it is a step in the right direction, hopefully. But we need to learn from the mistakes of the past. And Kirsten's highlighting the challenge with the existing climate finance is if you've got proposal writers and if you've got accountants and if you can meet the fiduciary requirements, you can access the funding. But what should be the priorities? The priorities should be around technical assistance, ability to deliver, proximity to the people who need the assistance the most. Those should be the priorities. And one of the things that civil society is pushing the negotiators working on the Santiago Network is let's learn from the mistakes of the existing structures and let's look and see how the Santiago Network can actually be designed to be most effective to overcome those problems. So it's not about having skilled proposal writers and budget people who can formulate budgets. It's about having technical capacity, proximity to communities to be able to deliver to those people who need the assistance. I don't think it's going to solve all of the problems, but I hope it's going to start to break down some of those silos. Thank you.
Manisha, thanks a lot, Colin. And I think that's something that is key, that, you know, how are we linking up with these conversations to try and understand as humanitarian action, where are we going to be placed best? And how are we going to increase our preparedness levels and response levels to this sort of, you know, changing dynamics and context, including the financing landscape that we're really not used to engaging in, would be also interesting for us as maybe future conversations to have to kind of unpack some of these information and understand a little bit better. Manisha, I think you had a bit of information that you wanted to share on the Menti, is it? Or
yes. Now I'll just let's take a look at the Menti poll, and then maybe I will come back to everybody for just maybe a quick final word from all of our panelists, just to kind of, you know, if you had one message for people to take away, what would it be on the road to COP27, and also any suggestions of how people can get engaged kind of in that joint advocacy around maybe the ISC task force or more of that joint messaging. Who should they get in touch with? But let's just first take a quick look at the Menti poll while you all come up with your minute response. So we're seeing quite a bit of relevance for most of you around loss and damage advocacy towards COP27. So it's quite relevant for most of you. So that's really excellent to see. So I think there's that feeling in our virtual room that, excuse me, we do have a lot of work to do around that loss and damage advocacy as we move towards COP27 and further along in the future as well, as you mentioned, Nina. Perhaps then I can just turn to all of you, just in a final thought from each of you, so that before we wrap up. And I'll do it in the same order in which you spoke, if that works. Colin, first you, and then Kirsten, Nina, Lindsay, if that works, please.
Thank you, everybody. I think we've covered an awful lot. It's a really complex area. I think looking to COP27, two critical issues are going to be on the agenda. The first one is, as I mentioned just now, the Santiago Network. What does it look like? How does it operate? Who are the participants? How does it engage effectively? Good ideas from the humanitarian community are needed to inform those discussions. So feeding into that process, whether it's by writing blogs, producing policy papers, we need ideas, we need good ideas. And there's a submission portal on the UNFCCC where ideas can be submitted to that process. The second critical issue in Sharm El-Sheikh will be making progress on the loss and damage finance facility. It's framed under the Glasgow Dialogue. That's how it's talked about in the negotiations language. But the Glasgow Dialogue is a process to identify the new and additional resources needed to respond to growing loss and damage. That will be an issue that will be on the agenda at COP27. And it's really critical that the adequate amount of discussion, that we can inform those discussions by highlighting where the gaps in the system are and where those additional resources are needed. Climate action is a whole of society approach, so we have a role to play. We have a voice. We should engage. The best way to engage is through the constituencies. And the UNFCCC has, I think, 9 recognised constituencies, including Indigenous peoples, including the research community, including environmental NGOs, etc. So engage through constituencies, but also talk to your government. They are the negotiators. They are the parties to the agreement. You may speak to people in the Ministry of Disaster Management, but they need to be talking to the people who are the focal points for the negotiations. We have to get these ideas fed in, else all those silos will remain. Thank you.
Kirsten, over to you.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. So maybe just jumping on what Colin said, I think the national level is incredibly important. As he said, we're more comfortable engaging with potentially ministries of foreign affairs or ministries of disaster management, and maybe not the relevant Ministry of Environment or Climate or whatever it happens to be in a given country. And I would say the first thing is to start engaging with them, and a little bit of that is speaking the right language and explaining the relevance of your work to them. And then, if possible, I'd say getting on the national government delegations to go to the COP would also be fantastic, because that is a great place to influence. And if there's ever a window, there is a real interest in the humanitarian voice in this conversation around loss and damage. And that conversation is at least meant to be this year and next, probably a lot longer, but it's certainly on the agenda for 27 and 28. The other thing I would think about is that there are some of the organisations on this call that are already registered and are turning up at the COP, but not at the other meetings. And I would say let's start turning up at a few more of the meetings. I think that would be really crucial to have that strong humanitarian voice. And then the final thing, just in terms of how we come together and how we collaborate, we've been talking at the Geneva level or the global level in terms of the ISC, and now climate is an issue on the agenda for the deputies. So where it sits in the ISC is at the deputies level. The deputies met last week. Hopefully they're going to set up some kind of a task force that will give them the action points to move on, but it does mean that it's been elevated to a priority for that group. Now, what is the equivalent in a country? Well, of course, you have the humanitarian country team. And at the moment, climate doesn't seem to be on the agenda for many humanitarian country teams, which is astounding given its impact in a lot of the countries where these teams exist. So I would say, yes, great, let's kind of push the deputies and push our principles and use ICFA, because ICFA sits on the deputies and also on the principles around this issue, and let's keep it on the agenda.
but let's also start rallying the humanitarian country teams at a country level to engage nationally and to be putting this issue into HNOs, into HRPs, and getting out some of the advocacy documents and think pieces and so on that Colin's mentioning at a country kind of combined level, I think would be incredibly useful.
Thanks, Kirsten. And also maybe suggest not only where there's a humanitarian country team, but in countries where you only have a UN country team, also pushing those resident coordinators as well. Thanks for that. Nina, I'm going to turn to you next.
Yeah, and I will not repeat what everyone else has said because I think I'm in full agreement with all of that. One of the things I wanted to say something about is participation, and I saw also that Thomas asked a question on that. And I think those of us who do have the famous observer status and can organize side events, etc., how do we make sure it's not just ourselves that are talking? We can organize the events, but we can have the people who are most affected and living this be the one who actually talks, either virtually or in person. So I think this is also a little bit about how do we make sure that when we talk about it, it's not just my research issue, but it's a lived issue. I also think when we talk about the participation and not only the COP27, but as Jasmine from the Egyptian mission pointed out, how to get civil society, NGOs, etc. in Africa and also in Egypt engaged. I don't think many people would believe it, but there's one Egyptian organization that has observer status with the UNFCCC process. It's RAA, the Arab Network for Environment and Development. We have been able to work with them for many years on human mobility, but I'm sure there's many others on this call that also work with other Egyptian or even bigger, the African NGOs and civil society. It's too late to get observer status, but it's not too late for those of us who have it to maybe add on colleagues from other organizations on our delegations. So yes, you won't have the tag with your organization name on it, but people could get into the COP. So I think this is a little bit also how do we as a sector try to make sure that they not just talk about everyone should participate, but how can we help it happen by those of us who have access today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nina. Lindsay, over to you, and then I'm going to turn to you, Nishani.
Thank you. I totally agree with everything that has just been said. To end, I would say we need humanitarians to be adding their voice to calls for finance for loss and damage, really bringing in the lived experiences of people, the national and the local contexts, and also the technical expertise in addressing loss and damage, because you are the ones doing it at the moment. It's been really great, I think, to see the engagement and like the willingness to engage on this issue. Let's work more together, create more spaces, and develop a shared language to kind of speak about loss of damage. And also just to say, yes, without the famous observer status, there's still a lot that can be done to build momentum towards COP27, because actually a lot of the decisions happen in the capitals well before negotiators go to COP. So, engage with your governments, with your COP negotiating teams before COP as well. And there's also the G20 takes place just before it. There's UNGA, United Nations General Assembly in September. We can bring a shared voice in there as well. Events, papers, let's do it.
Thank you so much. And absolutely. And we at ICPA will have been actually engaging in quite a few various processes. One of that was the C7 process. That's the Civil 7 process that was part of the discussions and common messaging that went out to the G7, which met. And one of that was obviously on climate change. And we actually happened to be able to put in the human mobility aspect into it, because that was part of that conversation that we've been having with Nina, with the community in the humanitarian sector, to ensure that humanitarian perspectives are brought in to these big conversations that are happening even at G7 COP levels. And definitely we'll be looking at how are we through the ISC, the deputies, through the charter processes, the charter signatories, how are we making sure that the messaging is going across? ICPA itself is not at this year for COP, because because we're not registered, but we will definitely use our membership and our partners like the IFRC, the ICRC, and Practical Action, though is not a member, is actually, there. And we have this mobilizing force. And not to forget, donors are obviously connecting with us more and more now to ask humanitarian actors to come together. And we've been, at many forums now to share some of our perspectives as humanitarian actors to make sure we're bringing in those. So please do connect with us. I have shared quite a few links already on the chat to connect, and the email addresses. We have a climate@icmanetwork.org email address and my email address, and we will be definitely reaching out to you through our various communications channels to provide input further on as we go. Over to you, Manisha.
Thanks very much, Nishani, and huge thanks to all our panelists. I think all of you, and Jasmine as well, before she had to leave, have really highlighted the importance of humanitarians coming together and really providing a collective, solid voice in those in the COP negotiations at COP27, but also in the lead up, given how much climate change is impacting our work, but also the inability of us as humanitarians to be able to address all the needs out there alone. So we really need to be talking in very simple language so that those going to the negotiations really understand what it is what are the impacts of climate change on humanitarian needs, and how to really make sure that we're getting the voices of those who are most affected into those rooms so that they can share their stories, and really working together to provide common messages without the logos, really coming together so that we're working together, so we don't all have to become experts like all of you are in terms of all the ways that the processes are working, our panelists, but really working together so that we're able to send those messages and really work on getting elements into the text, so that elements around human mobility, around loss and damage, and the need to get more financing in the grant form, not in the loan form, to those most in need, and through processes that are much simpler than what is out there, and really also pushing for that financing for that middle bit in between what humanitarians do and what those bigger, longer term development processes are, really pushing governments and donors to really be thinking about how to really put the money there, because it's becoming much more apparent, I think, as Kirsten, you said, it affects your family, but I think we're all feeling it, the fact that every year summers are getting hotter, or that, there's not as much snow in the mountains in the winter, which as a snowboarder is really heartbreaking to me. But, it's going to have a huge impact on all of us long term. And I think really that whole of society approach, as you put it, Colin, we all need to be engaged in this. And as humanitarians, really pushing through those negotiations that are coming up, but not only for COP27, but also looking ahead. So those who need to get the observer status, but working with those who already have that observer status to really get individuals to those different meetings and really showing up and explaining simply, for those negotiating, what are the impacts of climate change on humanitarian action. And I feel that this has been a really helpful conversation today. And thank you to all of you for explaining really all those elements around COP27. I've learned a lot today, so it's been really helpful for me. And I'm sure there's been lots of compliments in the chat as well. And thank you also to all of our panelists also for responding to lots of the questions that were posed by the audience. We will have a recording of the event at the website that is on your screens now. We'll have an audio and video, we'll have a video and audio only podcast format in the coming days on that website. There is an evaluation that we will be pasting into the chat shortly, but you'll also get an email about it. And we will be compiling all the various links that were shared during the session today in that email, as well, as Nishani said. Huge thanks again to our panelists, Jasmine, Colin, Kirsten, Nina, Lindsay, also to Ellen for doing the captioning, Marcus and Vaughn and all PHAP colleagues in the background that you don't see but are making sure everything works. Nishani, to you and ICFA for co-hosting and co-facilitating with me. And thanks to everyone in the audience as well for all your engagement today. And we look forward to seeing you at a next event. And thank you for engaging in the run-up to COP. Thank you all.